LAX was buzzing as usual. Suitcases rolled across polished floors. Flight announcements echoed overhead, and people hurried in every direction. In the midst of the organized chaos, a calm figure stood in the first-class line, quiet, unassuming, and completely out of place to some. That man was Joe Biden, wearing a simple gray blazer, a plain white shirt, and comfortable leather shoes that had clearly traveled miles. He carried a worn briefcase slung over one shoulder. There was nothing flashy about him. No security detail in sight, no entourage. He stood alone, peacefully, his eyes scanning the terminal with quiet reflection. Behind him, however, stood someone very different. Victor Harding, a successful investment consultant from Manhattan, looked every bit the part. His tailored navy suit screamed wealth. His tie was knotted with precision, and the glint of his Swiss watch caught the eye of every passing glance. He exuded confidence, bordering on arrogance, and took pride in making his presence felt. As Victor looked at the man ahead of him, his nose wrinkled slightly in confusion, maybe even disgust. "First class, huh?" he muttered with a smirk. "Never know who you'll run into these days." Joe turned slightly, offered a polite smile, and replied calmly, "The world's full of surprises." Victor raised an eyebrow. He had been fishing for discomfort, maybe a little embarrassment. But Joe's steady tone didn't give him the satisfaction. Still, Victor wasn't done. "No offense," he continued, lowering his voice just enough to make it sound like a casual observation. "But you don't exactly look like the first-class type. It's rare to see someone so casual up here." Joe didn't blink. "It's a seat on a plane," he said gently. "Nothing more." Victor chuckled, clearly amused. "Guess so. But let's be honest. There's a difference between flying and belonging." At that moment, the line began to move. The first-class passengers handed over their tickets. And soon Joe and Victor were boarding side by side. Joe walked at his own pace, measured, steady, unbothered by the hurried footsteps around him. Victor strutted confidently, sure of his place in the world. But as fate would have it, when they arrived at their seats, Victor stopped cold. He stared at the seat number on his ticket, then looked up. Joe Biden was already settling into the seat beside his. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered, shaking his head. Joe glanced over and gave another small smile. "Looks like we're traveling together." Victor sighed and sank into his seat, crossing his arms tightly. What were the odds? The man he had just dismissed in line was now sitting beside him, in one of the most exclusive parts of the plane, and the flight hadn't even taken off yet. The plane leveled out smoothly after takeoff, and the usual hush fell over the first-class cabin. Passengers tapped away, on laptops or reclined into their leather seats with drinks in hand. But Seat 2A had become the quiet center of something far more charged. Victor Harding leaned back in his seat, his arm brushing against the divider, pretending not to look at the man beside him. But curiosity or maybe irritation got the better of him. "So," Victor said, turning slightly, "what do you do?" Joe looked up from adjusting his seatbelt. "I work in public service," he said plainly. Victor squinted. "Retired or still involved here and there?" Victor chuckled. "Interesting. Must be nice, flying first class on a government pension." Joe didn't flinch. "I paid for this seat myself." Victor smiled to himself, satisfied he'd landed a small jab. He sipped his champagne and gestured subtly at the attendants. Everything about him screamed control, ownership, not just of the seat, but of the space, the moment, even the people. He leaned in slightly. "Look, I'm not trying to be rude, but this cabin, it's different. It's not just about money. It's about having a certain presence, a look, a lifestyle." Joe met his eyes and replied evenly, "I've learned that presence isn't always loud." Victor laughed. "You're full of little quotes, aren't you?" Joe looked back toward the aisle, unfazed. "You know," Victor continued, swirling the champagne in his glass, "this might sound harsh, but some places just aren't meant for everybody. You can sit in the seat, but it doesn't mean you belong in it." There was a pause. Joe turned back, not harshly, but with a steadiness that made Victor briefly shift in his seat. "Everyone lands in the same place when the plane touches down," Joe said. "It's not where you sit. It's how you carry yourself while you're there." A quiet murmur rippled from a few nearby passengers, subtle but unmistakable. Heads turned slightly, eyes lifted from screens. The tension, until now contained to two seats, was beginning to spill over. Victor crossed his legs and cleared his throat. He could feel the shift. Still, he wasn't ready to back down. He waved toward the flight attendant. "Another champagne, please." Something fitting of the moment. When the attendant reached Joe, he simply said, "Water's fine." "Thank you." Victor let out a sharp little laugh. "Water in first class? Don't tell me you're one of those simplicity is luxury types." Joe took the bottle and replied calmly, "Sometimes it is." Victor leaned closer now, his voice lower, as though he was explaining something to someone who clearly didn't get it. "See, that kind of talk? It works for people who never had the real thing. They dress it up as peaceful or humble, but deep down, they just couldn't get in." Joe didn't respond right away. He simply glanced around at the other passengers, then turned back to Victor with the same serene tone. "Maybe the real thing isn't what you think it is." Victor narrowed his eyes. "And I suppose you think you know better." "I don't think I know more," Joe said. "But I've seen enough to know that status doesn't make you wise. It just makes you louder." Victor sat back and rolled his eyes, trying to laugh it off, but the truth was something about Biden's composure rattled him. Not because it was confrontational, but because it wasn't. That kind of calm only came from someone who had absolutely nothing to prove, and that was the most threatening thing of all. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants moved down the aisle with dinner trays and folded napkins. The murmur of clinking silverware and hushed conversation filled the space, but the tension between seats 2A and 2B remained as thick as ever. Victor hadn't stopped watching Joe Biden. Each moment, Joe remained unfazed. Each silence he held without reacting. It chipped away at Victor's confidence. "Tell me something," Victor began again, swirling his fork in the untouched appetizer. "Do you really believe that all this, status, achievement, appearance, none of it matters?" Joe placed his napkin down. "I think it matters if it owns you. If it's all you have to show, then maybe it matters too much." Victor chuckled. "You sound like a man who's never had to earn his place." Joe tilted his head. "Son, I've earned more places than you've walked through." Victor blinked. The line wasn't sharp, but it cut. Joe continued, gently. "I've stood in rooms where people didn't think I belonged. I've buried children. I've sat in war rooms. I've ridden trains home from Washington when others took private jets. You think this seat is something to brag about?" Victor shifted. The name, the voice, the weight behind it, it began to dawn on him. But he wasn't ready to let go. "You talk like you've seen the world," Victor said with forced bravado. "But real success is about rising above the noise. You know, making your mark. That's what I've done. Built something. Proved something?" Joe looked at him. His voice was steady but quieter now. "And who are you when the lights go out? When no one's watching?" Victor hesitated. Joe leaned back slightly, his hands folded. "I've learned," he said slowly, "that people who spend their lives shouting about what they've built are usually afraid of what they'll find when the noise stops." Victor froze, unsure how to respond. "I'm not afraid of anything," he said at last. Joe didn't answer. He just looked out the window, toward the dark stretch of clouds outside, as if he wasn't trying to win, but to remind the man beside him of something he'd forgotten. Nearby, passengers had begun to listen in fully now. Some were pretending to read while clearly eavesdropping. A few even exchanged knowing glances. They didn't need a name to recognize wisdom when they heard it. And then it happened. A flight attendant returned quietly and bent down toward Joe's seat with a polite smile. "Mr. Biden, the captain asked me to confirm your arrival details in Tokyo. Everything's been arranged. He also sends his regards." Victor froze. He turned slowly toward Joe, his face losing color. "Wait, you're—" he stammered. Joe offered a small smile. "Yeah," he said softly. "That Joe Biden." Victor's mouth opened, then closed. His hands fumbled for the armrest. He looked around and realized the people he'd tried to impress had been watching, and they'd known long before he did. I didn't know," Victor stuttered. "You didn't say—" "I didn't think it was necessary." Victor shook his head. I didn't mean to—" Joe raised his hand gently. "Victor, what you said doesn't change because you found out who I am. The truth never depends on who you're talking to. It depends on how you treat them." There was no anger in his voice, only clarity, only a mirror. Victor sank back into his seat, and for the first time on that flight, he had nothing more to say. The silence that followed was heavy. Victor Harding didn't speak. Couldn't. He stared forward, past the seat in front of him, past the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane, trying to retreat into a world that no longer made sense. Joe Biden, meanwhile, reached down for his reading glasses, retrieved a book from the seat pocket, and calmly flipped it open. His composure hadn't changed. If anything, it deepened. The storm had passed for him, but not for Victor. He sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap, then relaxed them, then folded them again. Every so often, he stole a glance at the man beside him. As if to confirm that this was real, he had mocked him, judged him, called him out for dressing too simply, drinking water, lacking status. And now, the man beside him was not just someone. He was a former vice president, a man who'd walked the halls of power for over half a century, who had seen war, loss, victory, death, and dignity, who had earned his place in history not through flash, but through grit and grief. Victor felt exposed, raw. After several long minutes, he finally spoke, his voice lower than before. "Look, I owe you an apology." Joe didn't look up. "I wasn't just rude," Victor continued. "I was arrogant. I judged you without even knowing who you were." Joe turned the page of his book, then looked over gently. "And what if I wasn't Joe Biden?" Victor paused. "What if I was just a quiet man who didn't talk much, didn't wear a fancy suit, didn't own a $1 million company? Would your apology still be coming?" Victor swallowed. "Yes," he said, but the word felt smaller than he wanted it to. Joe gave a faint nod, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the armrest. "Victor, I'm not here to scold you. Life has a way of humbling all of us eventually. But here's the thing." He pointed to his chest quietly. "Who you are doesn't start when people know your name. It starts when you treat the janitor the same way you treat the CEO." Victor was silent again. "I spent most of my life around powerful people," Joe said. "Some had money, some had no soul. And the ones who made the biggest difference were almost never the loudest in the room." Victor blinked, visibly shaken. "I guess I got used to measuring everything by appearances," he admitted. Joe gave a slow, thoughtful nod. "A lot of us did. The world teaches us that." Victor looked down at his hands. "What you said earlier, about people who keep shouting, just to drown out their own fear. You were right." His voice cracked slightly. "I've spent my whole life proving I belonged in every room I walked into, proving I wasn't the kid with nothing in his pockets. And the more I proved it, the less I felt like myself." Joe placed the book down. "And what did you lose along the way?" Victor blinked rapidly. "I don't know. Maybe everything." There was no drama in his voice now, just truth and emptiness. Joe looked at him with real compassion. "Then maybe," he said, "this flight wasn't just about getting somewhere. Maybe it's about finding your way back." Victor's shoulders sank. His pride, his posturing, gone. What remained was something more fragile and more real. The other passengers had fallen into a quiet respect. No more sideways glances, no more whispers, just a soft stillness, as if they were witnessing something sacred, the undoing of a man and maybe the beginning of a new one. The plane began its slow descent into Tokyo. Seatbelt signs lit up, windows filled with the distant glow of city lights. But in seat 2B, Victor Harding hadn't moved in minutes. He wasn't thinking about time zones or meetings or the Rolex on his wrist. He was thinking about everything he'd just heard, about the man beside him, and about himself. Joe Biden sat quietly, sipping the last of his water. He hadn't spoken in a while. He didn't need to. His silence wasn't awkward, it was grounding. It gave Victor space, not the kind measured in inches, but in clarity. And then Victor did something that surprised even himself. He turned to Biden, his voice low, unsure. "I've spent so much time trying to prove I belonged in rooms like this. First class, boardrooms, gala dinners. Everything had to say something about me. Everything had to be loud." He paused, struggling. "But sitting next to you, watching how you handled me, I think I finally realized maybe I never needed to prove anything at all." Joe looked at him, not with pity but with sincerity. "You don't," he said softly. "You never did." Victor nodded, exhaling a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "You could have shut me down a dozen different ways," Victor continued. "Instead, you just let me talk. You let me burn myself out, and then you told the truth." Joe smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's all it takes. Let the noise pass. Then leave something that matters. The plane touched down gently on the runway. Passengers straightened up. Headphones came off. Seatbacks clicked forward. But in seats 2A and 2B, something else had shifted entirely. The people around them had seen it. Some recognized Joe Biden, most didn't. But all of them had watched. A man, once proud, once combative, lower his armor and admit he'd been wrong. As they exited the aircraft, Biden was greeted discreetly by a few crew members and airport staff. They nodded with respect. A young flight attendant leaned in and whispered, "Thank you, sir, for more than you know." Victor stood back for a moment, watching. He didn't rush. He didn't puff out his chest. He just watched Biden shake a few hands, give a few smiles, and disappear slowly into the crowd. That's when Victor noticed it. Passengers approaching Biden quietly. Not because of fame, not because of power, but because of presence. A presence that didn't demand attention. It earned it. Victor turned to the nearest terminal window and looked at his own reflection. For the first time in a long time, he didn't see the power tie or polished shoes. He didn't see a brand. He just saw a man who had a lot to think about. As the terminal filled with chatter and rolling bags, Victor didn't move. He stood there still. Joe Biden's final words echoed in his mind. The last thing the world needs is another man trying to feel bigger by making others feel small. Victor closed his eyes, and for the first time, he didn't feel small at all. He just felt human.